to staff members in hotel quarantine breaching well-known and well-understood infection control protocols. That is unacceptable to me.
Now, as a result, all flights will be diverted away from Melbourne for the next 2 weeks to lower the number of people in quarantine. There'll also be an inquiry into any breaches of hotel quarantine. Kudzo, can I start with you? Is this really necessary to control this outbreak?
If we reflect back to how things began, I think the one thing we've learnt from outbreaks, this one and previous ones, Ebola, for example, is that time is of the essence. You don't allow yourselves time to reach a critical tipping point before you act, and it's a lot easier to act at this point in time than to wait until you have multiple suburbs or areas affected. So in that sense, the message is really clear here in New Zealand, in other jurisdictions as well, that you don't wait, you act quickly, and as hard as it is to do it, it's far better to try and sort of snuff it out than to wait.
So you're not only an expert in infectious diseases, but necessarily in human behaviour and how humans react when you try to deal with infectious diseases. The Premier was talking about having these booze bus style vehicles, basically pulling cars and trucks and everyone over on the sides of the roads outside these hot zones to enforce it. How effective do you think that will be? Because it seems the one thing that he can't do is make people accept testing. 928 people, when someone knocked on their door or asked them to be tested, said no.
And that's really common, actually, especially in infectious diseases. We know with HIV testing, sort of sexually transmitted infection testing, and a host of conditions, people don't always want to get tested. And I guess that's the real challenge that we have, is that it's really challenging to police human behaviour. And a lot of the models that we even had around what was going to happen with the epidemic and the pandemic are based on, you can only build a model by putting inputs in, but there are lots of things that you needfully have to exclude. So we had anticipated that the peak here in Australia would be around May, June, and lots of things were put off for that reason, but that wasn't the case at all, and we're sort of now looking at what looks like a caterpillar curve. So rolling waves of outbreaks here and there, and it's impossible to police human behaviour in full or to understand what people's social networks look like, which suburbs they move between, and what the full, I guess, picture of their existence looks like. So the concept of booze buses and things, it could be tried, but with all of these things, you have to bring people along with you and have them understand the rationale for why you would invest time and effort to do certain things. And it's okay if people say they don't want to be tested, provided that they're willing to stay home if they're feeling sick, provided they're willing to, consider getting tested if they do become really unwell, because they'll want to know. And it gets to that tipping point where people think, look, if I'm sick, I would want to know because I want to make sure that I'm not passing it on to other people. But it's most challenging for people who are completely symptom-free to justify for themselves getting tested, especially if they're in a lockdown suburb and are already having to accept certain restrictions on their day-to-day.
Adam, it seems like COVID came and we understood about the 1.5 metres and the lockdown and all the rest of it. And then there was a moment where we went, nah, it's all good. And now we have to sort of learn it all again with some more nuance.
Well, I guess, we've been incredibly, I don't really want to say lucky, because it wasn't just luck. We managed this with a little bit of luck, a lot of science, some really pragmatic leadership at state and federal levels, and also by bringing the entire community along. Every Australian's done their part. But there was certainly a point where we realised that we probably weren't going to reach that worst case scenario that we all thought we were going to get to, and people just kind of relaxed. And
fatigue, I think Kudzo calls it, the fatigue with all of this. And the Premier's saying, this is it, guys, this is new COVID normal. There's no fatigue with normal, right?
Yeah, but in many ways I actually look at this as being quite reassuring, because this is not something that was not expected. Months ago we were talking about we would have a period of lockdown and then we would try and lift that, and then if it resurged, then we would have to go back into lockdown, and it might be region specific. This is,
and we would build up intensive care, and we would build up medical supplies.
Exactly. And everything that we've sort of hypothesised would happen has happened. In the areas that it kind of hasn't gone to the way that we thought we were, we've actually performed a lot better. The mortality rate is lower than what we thought it would be. The management, medical professionals have done an enormously good job on handling the actual treatment of the disease. You know, the vaccine's the sexy panacea, but there's an awful lot that goes on that's not a vaccine that makes sure that people are still staying alive and recovering faster and not passing it on. So as difficult as it is for an awful lot of Victorians, this is actually also kind of what's expected.
Peter, you feel for those businesses. The Victorian Premier announcing today, on top of the $10,000 grant to help them along, another $5,000 urgent grant. And here they go again. Can you imagine it in other parts of Australia? Imagine it. Cafes, restaurants, hotels are back to takeaway only. The gyms are closed, right? All
and let's switch to masks and then go out together.
And let's forget everything else.
Yeah.
Let's talk borders. The surge of new cases in Victoria has shaken the confidence of many of the country's premiers. The plan to have all state borders open by the end of July is all of a sudden looking a little bit shaky. Today, South Australia was the first to push back their reopening plans.
In this instance, we are just not confident that we can lift that border with Victoria on the 20th of July, but we will provide a firmer update with regards to New South Wales and the ACT later this week.
Queensland, which has come under fire from the government for not opening up their borders, today announced everyone is welcome from July 10. Everyone except, you guessed it, Victorians.
Anyone who has travelled from Victoria, including Queenslanders, will be prevented from entering or will have to quarantine at a hotel at their own expense for 2 weeks. We just can't risk removing border restrictions for people coming from areas of Victoria right now.
In New South Wales, no change. Gladys Berejiklian says the borders are remaining open but wants front doors to be closed to anyone from Melbourne.
You are the boss of who comes into your home. Do not allow anyone from a hotspot in Melbourne or from Greater Melbourne to come into your home. You have the right to say no.
Shay, let's start with you. You're the treasurer of a surf club on the Queensland-New South Wales border. What's the impact of this announcement from the Queensland Premier today to open up that border in a few days?
The surf club being on the border has been a really challenging experience because half of the consumers are located in New South Wales and half of them are in Queensland. The staff are in 2 different states, so logistically, it's been a real challenge. But that being said, it's been very comforting for most of the community that we've had the borders closed up until now. And I welcome the decision to open it on July 10 because I think it's a really good time for us to look at opening up, and we're just starting. The businesses are starting to open back up. Our surf club is now operating 3 nights a week, and as we move forward past July 10, that will actually allow us to open up more nights because there'll be more opportunity to have people coming in across the border from New South Wales.
Peter, the Queensland Premier talked about the border wars today. She said Queensland had been singled out. It was assumed she was talking about the Prime Minister there, that she'd had similar controls on her borders as the South Australian and Tasmanians. They're not Labor premiers, and that she'd been silent for a long time, but she was standing up for what she believed in. Is she right to feel aggrieved about the criticism from Canberra?
Well, I think everybody would be aggrieved. They've all been criticising each other, I think, constructively in the main. So I think she's probably playing politics there, and that's fine. Get used to that. So I think they've done a great job in Queensland. I mean, that's the main thing, and they've kept the border closed, and, you know, we've ummed and ahed in businesses whether that's right. But seeing what's happened in Melbourne, you think, yeah, look, you know, you've got to say what's happened has been very good. But the lesson from Melbourne to everybody across Australia, the lesson is don't let it happen. Don't let a breakout happen. Follow the instructions. If you have to be quarantined, just go in there, be isolated, and then you can wait 2 weeks and come out. And if you have to be tested, I think go and take the test. I think there's no reason you shouldn't take the test. It's about the whole community, not about you. Real fast, Adam, do you think it'll work? Fines, if you want to go over that Queensland border and you say you're a Victorian and or you don't declare you're a Victorian, you get a $4,000 fine. Do you think that'll do the job?
I think people are actually going to take it a little bit more seriously than trying to get around it. You know, firstly, I'm not sure how many Victorians are desperate to get into Queensland to go on holiday at the moment anyway. But more or less, I think people are going to want to holiday in their own states unless they're wanting to visit family.
It's a long way to drive
and
be turned back, isn't it, at Coolangatta Tweed Heads and say, come on, kids.
And a $4,000 fine is gonna make people think twice as well.
Absolutely. Imagine the kids in the back. Coming up, the coronavirus crisis has been touted as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to rebuild our manufacturing sector. But how easy will that be? More on that a little later. Now, here's a question for you. How many Australian states legislate that political advertisements must be truthful, as in not contain actual lies? What do you reckon, 3, 5, all of them? Answer's 1. South Australia. The ACT is looking to join them, though, with the Greens pushing hard to introduce laws that would make it illegal to disseminate factually incorrect political material or advertising during an election campaign. But it's important to note that when Australia tried to bring in similar laws at a federal level back in 1983, they were dumped a year later. At a time a bipartisan group found enforcing the rules was unworkable. Perhaps when it comes to politics, the idea of truth is just too intangible, Adam.
It doesn't really put politics in a great light. But the reality is...
Who can say truth or lie?
The idea of truth is something that is a lot more difficult to define than we think it is. You know, even our legal system doesn't deal in truth. We deal in evidence. We deal in the balance of probabilities or beyond reasonable doubt. You know, you're not actually trying to prove something that's true. You're trying to actually support a concept or a hypothesis with evidence. And in the political realm, it's a little bit more difficult as well, because you're looking generally into the future. You're saying something like this will happen, and nobody in politics comes to the idea of truth with clean hands. But I think the reality is that when you're trying to say something has to be true, well, who's the one that's going to say that it is true or not? You know, this probably becomes something more like just another cog in the machine of political gamesmanship. You know, rather than I'm referring this to the AFP, it's like I'm going to refer this to the AEC because this is a lie, and then all of a sudden after the election nobody cares about whether it was true or not in the first place.
I suspect that's a lawyer's answer. Could I get a doctor's answer? Is there any such thing as truth? It's come to this.
There is truth in diagnostics, but I guess there are parallels in medicine in the sense that often what you are working with is balance of probabilities. But I think we're fortunate in medicine is that people don't usually think you're going to make up a test result because you've got to head off for work, you know, head off home early one day, or you've got a particular agenda that you're trying to drive. So we're lucky in medicine is that we're working with a patient to try and reach a conclusion that on the weight of the evidence available is as true an answer as we can provide. So diagnostics, even the COVID ones, have a margin of error. They will sometimes give you a false result. But we always start the discussion with that in mind, that we will try and give you the best answer we can, but please remember that we may at times get it wrong.
But that's different from lying.
Yeah, absolutely. But where I think there is scope in politics is for there to be some retrospective audit of claims that were made, and then the justification, a re-justification of why they were made and whether or not they were actually found to be true at all. Because often what we have is this rolling cycle of just moving through. People say things, it's a 24-hour news cycle. You can say whatever you want, and then you're never actually examined again. Because there's always some measure with which you can bring a quantitative aspect to it to actually justify whether or not the original claim was accurate, and to account for it over time. And I think that's what's perhaps missing, and it could be brought in to try and bolster that shift towards a more truth-based or a truth-based policy narrative as you're heading towards an election, for example.
Isn't that the famous thing at the US Supreme Court, Adam, which was they were trying to come up with a definition for pornography, and wasn't the famous comment that they know it when they see it? I mean, isn't that what truth's like? You know it when you see it?
I like that idea, but also by the time we have that retrospective look at everything, the election's already over, so it's
everyone's
not going to stop anyone from doing
exhausted.
anything.
No one believes anyone.
But I think our relationship with the truth as a society, I don't think we understand it very well. We don't believe things because we don't see the facts. You know, the facts in the information age are readily available to anyone who wants to go and find them. We don't believe things because somebody tells it to us. We believe things because we want to. You know, we believe things because it's emotionally convenient. And as we kind of careen towards this hyperpartisanship that most democracies are undergoing at the moment, that idea of believing the truth over believing what your side says is becoming more and more elusive, I think.
I think this becomes a game of words, though, doesn't it? I guess for my engineering mind, it's black and white. There's fact and then there's fiction. And I, as a voter, would love some assurance that what I'm actually being told is based in fact and not, in fact, a play on words or a fiction. I think it's great that South Australia has that. And I know we can talk around the language and the words. And Adam, I understand where you're coming from as a lawyer, but coming from an engineer, there's right and wrong and there's fact and fiction, and it's very black and white.
Oh, the bridge falls down.
Exactly.
Peter, I mean, a couple of things sprang to my mind looking at this. One was there are plenty of ways to distort the truth. You've been around Canberra long enough to know about all of this. I mean, I saw that Rick Morton in the Saturday paper revealed that the federal government has finalised a $200,000 offer for consultants to prepare a secret report on the impact of public broadcasters on commercial operators. Now, this secret report won't be published, but it's going to be used to inform policy and decision makers by ministers. Now, as we know in the past, you know, there have always been concerns of governments of any stripe. Are they amending media laws or changing the media landscape to tickle up the powerful, right, commercial proprietors to get their favourable coverage? Isn't that just as troubling as false advertising?
Oh, absolutely. Listening to the debate, you think they're saying that you have to be truthful, tell the truth during an election. What about the rest of the time? You know, like I can make things up as I go along. And of course, there's more players in the political space than the politicians themselves. There's, of course, the union movements and industry associations. And